My name is Reed Dawsonbrock. I am the Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs at UH Manoa. I'm representing the Chancellor. She went to Japan for the one-year anniversary of the tsunami and is on her way back. I think she's on the airplane as we are speaking. It is great to see all of you here. This is a sign of exactly what we want to do at Manoa, at UH in general, is to be a place for vibrant exchange, a place for community, a place for intellectual activity. So I want to first by acknowledging Governor, thank you for coming. Whoa. Of course, what we're most proud of here is, of course, that he is a proud UH alum, as well as the governor. And he's sitting next to another proud UH alum, Dr. Nancy Caraway. I also want to make a personal acknowledgement. I don't know very much about economics, but the only thing I know about it is from my mother-in-law, Meru Jasawala, who's sitting in the front row, an emeritus faculty member in economics and fellow at the East-West Center. So thank you for coming, Meru. Quite a few people made this evening possible. We need to thank Dr. Stephen Paulie and Mrs. Paulie, who've come from the mainland for this lecture. We have sponsorship from the community, the Bank of Hawaii, Donna Tanoe, and from Kyoyu Limited, Ernie Nishizaki, and they have helped make this event possible. We also, of course, have support from the university. We want to thank President Greenwood, Marcy Greenwood. Gary Ostrander and the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research and Graduate Education. And finally, Denise Conan, the new dean, but of course also former interim chancellor, new dean of the College of Social Sciences. And my next task is to introduce Denise.
Aloha. Well, thank you, Reed. The College of Social Science is so thrilled to be host to tonight's distinguished lecture from Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz. So sorry. It's just amazing to see the kind of turnout we have tonight here for our Nobel Prize winner. I'm seeing students and faculty from across the university with books in hand. It's really a treat to see here not just the economists, but also the political scientists, sociologists, our English professor over here. We have oceanography professors here, and I'm sure I'm missing many disciplines here tonight, but one thing about Joseph Stiglitz is that he is a rare economist in that his brilliant insights really cut across the intellectual field, and he has so much to offer in insights for all of us. For our guest here this evening, I really want to say that Social Sciences is very pleased to offer events like this. If you're not aware, Social Sciences, the College of Social Sciences, Why not? Brilliant. It's brilliant. Okay. I think this is a first for Orvis Auditorium. Okay, welcome. Okay, so the College of Social Sciences, if you're not familiar, it's the largest college on our campus. We have 12 departments ranging from anthropology all the way to W for women's studies. And our faculty really are bringing global prominence to the University of Hawaii in so many fronts in terms of global affairs, environmental policies, human rights, indigenous politics, public health, peace studies, youth and crime, and we could go on with this list. We're also leading the university in providing research and service learning experiences for our students. How many of you are social sciences students here tonight? All right, a big hand for you. I want our public to know that our students in the social sciences, more than 1,000 students are volunteering in our community through our service learning programs. And through that, we're transforming the lives of our students, and our students are transforming the lives of our community in so many ways. I'm also very pleased to let you know that tonight's lecture is co-hosted by the University of Hawaii's Sea Grant program under the sponsorship of Stephen and Marilyn Paulie, and we are so thankful for that. Thank you. We in the College of Social Science are very pleased to be partnering with the Natural Sciences because so many of the hard issues that we face in our world, this is rather amazing. I hope I look okay from behind, but okay.
We call this in music thinking on your feet. We're doing that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So with that, let me call up Gordon Graw to talk just a little bit about the Paulie lecture series.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce the Paulie Seminar in Sustainability to all of you. I'm Gordon Graw. I serve as the director of the Sea Grant College program. We're a unit. Thank you. We're a unit of the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology, and it's a real pleasure to be able to work with Dean Conan and her college. It's real honor and pleasure also to introduce the Paulie lecture. And I can't introduce that lecture without talking about Stephen and Marilyn Paulie. Many of you are familiar with the generosity of the Paulie family over the many years to our university and to our state. It began in the late 1940s when Edwin Paulie, Stephen's father, first invited the university to build a marine lab at Moko'oloi, or Coconut Island. Stephen's mother, Barbara Paulie, later Pagan, continued that benefaction by making a generous donation through the Paulie Foundation that allowed the Paulie Laboratory to be built in the late 1990s. She did so with the advice and collaboration of her son, Stephen, and this provided the foundation for the great success that the Institute has enjoyed over the last few years under the leadership of its director, Professor Joanne Leong. Their generosity would be singular and remarkable in its own right, but their continuing service and support to our university and to our state has allowed us to thrive in a way that would not otherwise be possible. Marilyn Paulie is a leader and visionary in higher education and the arts, serving on many important boards. She serves on the trustees of Pomona College. She's on the advisory council of our program. She was on the board of the Center for a Sustainable Future and has served on the board of the Sun Valley Summer Symphony. Dr. Paulie practiced otolaryngology for many years in Los Angeles and in Sun Valley. He serves on our faculty at the Hawaii Sea Grant College program. He's published numerous papers on the biological effects of night lighting and has worked toward implementing environmentally appropriate codes and ordinances in a variety of municipalities. He's known affectionately as Dr. Dark under those. He's also served on a number of important boards as well. The Paulie family, Stephen and Marilyn, continue to provide inspiration and vision supporting our university and state. In 1998, at the dedication of the new Paulie Laboratory, Dr. Paulie posed a set of questions and a challenge for our university and for our Institute of Marine Biology. He asked, can we relate the first-rate science that our institute undertakes to improving the well-being of our coastal ecosystems, the Hawaiian Islands, the Pacific Ocean, and our people? Can we make Coconut Island a model for sustainable living? Can we leave the comfort zones of our narrow disciplines and work together to relate the outcomes of our science and humanities to the well-being of our community? Can we find the courage to shape public policy to improve our environment? And if by doing these things, can we end up with a healthier ecosphere through our efforts to reconnect people with our natural world? He said that then the gifts of the Paulie family to the university and the people of Hawaii would have real meaning, not only for the present, but also through to the 7th generation. In naming the seminar after Stephen and Marilyn Paulie, we express our gratitude for their generosity and service, and we also embrace their vision and their challenge. Thank you.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce our president, Dr. Marcy Greenwood. I've been really energized by the dynamism that President Greenwood brings to our university. She's a really strong advocate for higher education and is very actively right now promoting a research industry here in Hawaii, and she's been a contributor in so many ways. I think one important thing, though, is President Greenwood is a member of the Institute of Medicine and then in the National Academy of Sciences, and she served as the Associate Director for Science in the White House Office of Science, Technology, and Policy under the Clinton administration. And that link to the Clinton administration is very important for us because she was able to pick up a phone and call her dear friend, Dr. Joseph Stiglitz, and arrange for him to come here tonight. So with that, let's please join me in welcoming Dr. Marcy Greenwood to the stage.
Well, aloha. What an amazing crowd. And it's such a pleasure to see all of you here to listen to our speaker tonight. And in a moment, I will introduce him. But I do want to thank all of you for taking the time to come. And I hope you're going to be reasonably comfortable for the next period of time. But right this moment, it is my pleasure to introduce the sponsor, one of the co-sponsors of tonight's lecture, Dr. Stephen Paulie. But before I do that, I want to thank both Stephen and Marilyn for being very generous supporters of this university. They've really set a standard of philanthropy that we're both proud of and which we deeply admire. Stephen and Marilyn have both served on the Center for a Sustainable Future board. As you know, the Center for a Sustainable Future is a UH-affiliated nonprofit organization that brings together scientists, economists, and engineers to address sustainability issues. And they have never been more important in the history of our nation and in the history of the world. They've also served on our UH Grant College program. But probably more importantly and more poignant and more directly related to their relationship with the university, as a child, Stephen Paulie spent his summers on Coconut Island, which was owned by his father, Edwin Paulie, at that point. His father, as you heard from Gordon Grau, was instrumental in establishing what is now Hawaii's Distinguished Institute of Marine Biology. So he now heads the Edwin Paulie Foundation. That is the foundation that gave the university at a very critical time in our history $10 million to buy Coconut Island and to build a new laboratory there. They also support the Institute's program in marine biology for an annual research and graduate level training program. Stephen has been an affiliate faculty member of the UHC grant program. The Paulie Foundation has endowed the Stephen M. Paulie Professorship in Environmental Studies at Steve and Maryland's alma mater, Pomona College. So these are generous philanthropists who, while they do help the University of Hawaii, help students in other parts of the country as well. And the lecture tonight is part of the Stephen and Molly Sustainability Series, Stephen and Marilyn Paulie Sustainable Series. And so I'd like to invite him, Stephen, to say a few words before I introduce our distinguished speaker tonight. So, Dr. Paulie.
Thank you, President Greenwood. Thank you so much. Actually, Professor Stiglitz is going to have about 5 minutes to speak, I think. Especially when these people up here want to go. You want to give a speech, maybe? We got a lot of speakers here. But I just want to thank everyone for such a great turnout, and to President Greenwood and to Dean Conan for being a co-sponsor with us. And I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Joanne Leon, who's director of HIMB at Coconut Island. And this would not happen without the vision and leadership of Dr. Gordon Graw, director of Sea Grant, who together we've seen a vision for Coconut Island. And what we want out there is for it to become a model for sustainable systems, where we can bring in people from around the Pacific Rim to talk about environmental issues related to marine ecosystems. We're moving along in that direction. Things go slowly because it's Hawaii, but we're going to get there. And but I do want to say that Professor Stiglitz and I do have some things in common. I don't have a Nobel Prize yet, but we both went to Columbia, and we were born about the same time. I think that's commonality. But I won't take any more of your time. Thank you so much for this honor, and I want to be sure I acknowledge my wife, Marilyn, down here, who's always here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paulie, and you're making a very good point that we are using up all of Dr. Stiglitz's time. So I'm going to be very brief here, since I'm now the fifth speaker standing between the entree and the hors d'oeuvres, which are not nearly as interesting as he's going to be. But I do want to acknowledge one person who's here in the audience for helping us to bring Dr. Stiglitz here, and that's Dr. Nancy Carraway. Our First Lady, I probably shouldn't tell this, and the Governor and the First Lady might not speak to me afterwards, but I do remember the discussion. It's while we were dealing with some very heavy APEC issues and discussions, and Dr. Carraway said to me, "Can't we elevate the level of discourse?" And her suggestion was that we try to find out if Dr. Stiglitz was willing to come and share his thoughts with us. Clearly, that was a good decision. I've been to a lot of universities. I've been to a good number of Nobel laureate lectures. I've never seen a crowd as big as this, and I'm sure you're going to be well rewarded. Now, I'm going to say only you all have read about Dr. Stiglitz. He got the Nobel Prize in 2001. He also got the John Bates Clark Medal in 1979. He's the former senior vice president and chief economist for the World Bank. He founded the Institute for Policy Dialogue, which is a think tank at Columbia, where he is now a professor. And his publications, which I might add as a biologist, are eminently readable, even for those of us who don't pride ourselves on being economists. But the other thing I want to tell you about Joe Stiglitz is he's the best friend that academic research in the United States has probably ever had. when he was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, and I had the privilege of serving in the same administration with him. The CEA put out a report on the impact of the investment in academic research scientists on the United States. And they reported that it was a 70% return on investment. Think about that, folks. 70% return on investment. That means that all the hard work that many people in this audience do and all the research that has been done by many before and those who will come after is one of the best investments the United States can ever make. And it is an investment in our people and in our minds and in the products and processes that will come in the future. So that you will hear, or if you haven't heard, you will hear, from a Nobel laureate. You don't have to take it from the president. So with that, it is a great personal pleasure to have Nobel laureate Dr. Joe Stiglitz take the podium.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction and for this reception. I feel very bad having, you have to listen to my back. And when I went to Washington, one of the things they told me is, always watch your back. But I assume I won't have that problem here. The subject of this talk is where long-term and short-term goals converge, using sustainability as an impetus for economic growth and recovery. What I'm going to do is first talk about how the lack of sustainability was behind the crisis that the United States and the world have been going through. And then I'm going to try to talk about how we can have the basis of sustainable recovery by focusing on sustainability. And finally, I'll make a few remarks, perhaps controversial, about Hawaii, and maybe touch on a few raw nerves. Okay, so first let me begin a picture of the world before the crisis. It's a long time ago. We had growth, but it was clearly not economically sustainable, and I'll come back in a few minutes and talk about why it was not economically sustainable. But the word sustainability has many dimensions. It was also not environmentally sustainable, and I'll come back and talk about that. But nor was it socially sustainable. One of the remarkable things remarkable in a negative sense, about the growth of the United States in the years before the crisis was that more than 100% of the gains went to the top. And just think about that. What that meant was the top was doing very well, but most Americans were not. Median income, the income of the person in the middle, half above and half below, is today actually lower than it was 15 years ago. And if you look at that income, it was only there because most people are working longer hours if they can get a job. So if you look at the median income of a full-time male worker, his income today is the same as it was a third of a century ago. And this is in a country which has supposedly been having strong growth. And when you have that kind of inequity in a society, it will not be socially sustainable. One of my predecessors as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors very sagely put it, growth which is not sustainable won't be sustained. And of course, that's what happened in the United States. Our growth wasn't sustainable, and our growth was not sustained. But one of the concerns I have that I'll come to in the second part of my talk is our recovery, as we've been designing it, is not sustainable. And the worry is that as a result, it won't be sustained. As I said, there are many dimensions to sustainability, and I'm going to focus most of my time on economic sustainability, but I'll come back to the other dimensions a little bit later. Our growth was very debt-financed, very debt-based. It was consumption-driven. The savings rate in the United States in the years before the crisis plummeted to zero. And it should be obvious that a household savings rate of zero is not building a basis for long-term economic growth and therefore was not sustainable. But it was actually worse than that. The bottom 80% of Americans were consuming about 110% of their income. The question is, why was this the way that our economy was functioning? What was going on? And the answer actually is related to the point about social sustainability that I mentioned before, related to the inequality that was growing in the United States. The people at the top are able to save. They don't have to consume everything that they earn. And on average, the savings rate at the top is 15 to 20%. While those at the bottom are trying to just get by, and they tend to consume everything that they earn. What does that mean? If we redistribute money from the bottom to the top, that means total consumption would normally go down. Total spending would go down because the people who are getting the money are spending less than the people who are giving up the money. And in the United States, we've had an enormous increase in inequality in the last 15 years. It's been going on actually, used to be said that watching income distributions change was like watching the grass grow. It happens very slowly, but over time it gets back. But in the last decade, in the years from 2000 to 2008, it happened much more rapidly. So that by the time of the crisis, the top 1% of the United States was garnering for themselves something like 23% of all the national income. And obviously that was disproportionate. And even within that group, the top 1/10 of 1% was getting a disproportionate share. Well, America, our Federal Reserve, solved the problem of insufficient demand. It solved it by telling the people whose income was going down, don't let it bother you. Just consume as if your income was going up. And the one thing that Americans did remarkably well was to consume. And that was really, in a nutshell, the story of our crisis, that we were consuming beyond our means. Households were consuming beyond our means, and in some sense, our country as well. Well, in a way, the Federal Reserve and our financial systems facilitated this. The Federal Reserve didn't regulate the financial institutions in the way they should have. That lax regulations, low interest rates, combined to create a bubble that made Americans feel like they were doing very well. But they weren't. And in fact, what we now see is that the bottom of our income distribution has now lost an enormous amount of wealth. So while we talked about creating an ownership society, we've actually created a society in which wealth is much more unequally distributed than income, where the top 1% has roughly 40% of all the wealth of the country. Well, the financial sector, as I said, did not do, it should be obvious, a very good job doing what it's supposed to do. Financial sectors are very important. Banks are very important. They were a little worried. I'm giving a talk tomorrow, partly sponsored by the banks. They were a little worried about what I was going to say. But I think a well-performing financial sector is absolutely essential for a well-performing economy. So I'm all in favor of good banks. The problem was too many of our banks, and particularly our big banks, and I'll say particularly our two big banks our big banks in New York City, decided to focus not on creating wealth, on lending to small businesses, to trying to grow the economy on the basis of sound principles, but they were focused on things like predatory lending, speculation. They were making large amount of money out of anti-competitive practices, like the control of the payments mechanism, the credit cards, and even out of discrimination. It is striking that 45 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, a couple of America's premier financial institutions had to plead guilty, or not plead guilty. They neither deny but they pay $100 million fines for discrimination against minorities. And these are practices that were widespread around the country and generated high fees and high incomes. Well, one of the areas of my own research has been focused on the economics of information. And information is key to good lending. And our banks obviously were not doing good lending practices. One of the reasons was, in fact, they moved away from their local basis. Local financial institutions are more likely to know who are good borrowers and who are not. They engaged in securitization, which meant that they could divest themselves of the loans that they had created, and somebody else would bear the consequences of bad lending practices. And so that's one of the reasons, one of the things that I think, I apologize, one of the mistakes the Clinton administration made in the 90s was that it eliminated the restrictions on interstate that used to focus banks to try to encourage them to be more local. Now, the argument was that by then, most of the regulations had already been stripped away, so that in fact, the subterfuges dominated. But the response should have been, let's try to keep banks focused on lending rather than on these other activities that I described before. Just as an aside, an interesting aspect of this recent financial crisis was the role that financial market liberalization and capital market liberalization, the fact that funds could move so easily across borders and that banks have become so internationalized, was one of the reasons the crisis that began in the United States spread so quickly around the world and became a global crisis, not just an American crisis. Now, there's always a flip side of this. When I'm talking to my European audiences, I always thank them because they bought 40% of all our toxic mortgages. And had they not done that, the crisis in the United States would have been even worse. But that's really not a good argument for those kinds of practices. So what I try to do just very, very quickly is to try to give a sense in which, before the crisis, our economy was not economically sustainable. It was also not environmentally sustainable. And there are many dimensions to this environmental sustainability. One that I've been very involved in was global warming. One of the things that Marcy didn't mention was we at the Council of Economic Advisors, we worked very closely with the OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and I was one of the American delegates to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and one of the lead authors of the 95 report, where we examined the evidence on global warming. And it was even then overwhelming. The only mistake that we made was we underestimated the speed with which it was occurring and the severity of the consequences. But what is so clear is that our planet won't survive if other countries try to imitate America's consumption patterns. That are environmentally, we are just not sustainable. And of course, everybody's been focusing on greenhouse gases, but the same issues arise with respect to other basic resources like water. And so that the issues of environmental sustainability are absolutely critical. In some sense, of course, what we're talking about in terms of our economic crisis is a crisis of a short duration. We'll be over that. But our environmental crisis, we won't be over in 5 years or 10 years. It is something that if we don't address now, it will become even worse. So this is the broad picture of the world before the crisis. Now where are we? The report that came out last Friday suggested that recovery may be on the way. Of course, there have been many other occasions when people from the administration, from the Fed, and from other parts of the financial community have said, talked about green shoots. And before those green shoots actually grew, they turned brown. And so there's obviously some nervousness whether this is a sustainable recovery. Let me put the numbers a little bit in perspective. The number of new jobs created in the month of February was around 250,000. The economy needs to generate normally, we're not in a normal period, but normally, about 150,000 jobs in order to provide jobs for the new entrants in the labor force, the young people graduating from college and so forth. And that means that we are only making a small dent in the stock of unemployed. In other words, 100,000 people who were unemployed are moving out of unemployment. Well, the number of people who are unemployed in the United States is a really serious problem. I describe it saying that the labor market in the United States is in shambles. Roughly 23 million Americans who would like a full-time job can't get one. It's just under 1 out of 6 Americans who would like a full-time job and can't get one. Almost 50% of the people who are unemployed have been unemployed for 6 months or more, which are called long-term unemployed. America's unemployment insurance system is geared to an economy in which people lose jobs and then get a job very quickly. And so we have very, very weak long-term unemployment insurance. Across the board, we have one of the worst unemployment insurance systems in the advanced industrial countries. But in particular, we have nothing for those who've been unemployed for 99 weeks or more. And these are just left on their own. And the numbers that are unemployed for this length of time is now numbering in the millions. Well, what does all this mean? Well, it means if we continue at the current pace of, say, taking out 100,000 per month from this stock of unemployed, we'll be back to full employment sometime around 2025. It's obviously not a very good picture. Now, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, is much more optimistic. They think we'll be back to full employment around 2018. But what I want to give you is a feeling that, in fact, the American economy is not really recovering very strongly. The basic mathematics, the basic arithmetic of this is actually very simple. If the economy increases productivity at the rate like it did in the 90s, or even a little bit slower, normally it increases productivity at something like 2 to 3% a year. That means output per worker per hour increases 2 to 3%. And the labor force grows at about 1%. Now that means that if we are going to break even in terms of creating growth that will create new jobs for the new entrants in the labor force, we have to grow at something like 3 to 4% a year. And no one sees our economy growing at that pace. But if we're going to bring down the stock of unemployment, we have to grow much more rapidly than 3 to 4% per year. And so the prospects of doing that seem very bleak. Let me try to explain why things are so bleak, and then suggest what the answer might be. Well, one of the things you hear from time to time about the recovery is the consumer is coming back. And we gave tax cuts to encourage the consumers to come back. It didn't work. But if we're focusing on sustainability, that's not the right strategy. Because the problem was, before the crisis, we had unsustainable consumption. We had a savings rate of 0. And we don't want the consumer to come back like that. If they did, it would mean that our recovery would be unsustainable and we would be in trouble. Another crisis would be just down the road. So we cannot have a consumer-led recovery, at least in terms of getting back to the way the world was in 2007. It's not the kind of world we want to recreate. Now, some people have talked about exports as getting us back a recovery. Well, I wish that were the case, but in a world in which Europe is also having crisis, our largest markets are not going to be buying much from us. In fact, because of their crisis, their exchange rate is likely to fall, and we'll have trouble competing with them in third markets. I jokingly say that sometimes with the whole world in an economic downturn, the only place we can export is Mars or the Moon, and trade relationship with them are still uneasy. So exports are not going to be the basis of our recovery. What about investment? Well, if we looked at the normal pattern of investment, what we would see is we have excess capacity in many industries, and when there's excess capacity, there won't be investment. The one part where there's an obvious excess capacity across the country is real estate. And that's important because before the crisis, 40% of all investment was in real estate. And even after we fix our financial system, and it's not perfectly fixed, but even after we fix it perfectly, we're not going to rapidly start building housing. We just have so much excess capacity. The good thing about the way we managed the rapid construction during the housing bubble is that we built a lot of shoddy construction. And that means it won't last that long, but it will still be 10 years before it falls apart and we can start constructing again. So that's the good side of what's happened. But that means investment is going to be in terms of the normal direction of investment, is going to be constrained. In fact, what we're doing now may, in fact, be setting the agenda for a jobless recovery. There are a lot of discussions about will jobs come back as GDP grows, and it has to do with the rate of growth of productivity. Some people are hoping that we will stop being productive. It's not a good way of recovering, obviously, and it's obviously not a sustainable way if we're concerned about living standards. But one of the things that may have struck me and may have struck you, if you look around grocery stores, drugstores, that we're replacing unskilled laborers by robots, by machines. So it's a very strange thing. We have this massive unemployment, and we are replacing and creating more unemployment by replacing these relatively unskilled workers by machines. And the question is, why are we doing this? Isn't this a strange way for an economy to behave? And the answer is partly the Federal Reserve is keeping interest rates down to close to zero. And when cost of capital is as cheap as it is, it's cheaper now to buy a machine, because the cost of, you borrow long-term at a relatively low interest, the cost of capital is low, and you might as well fire the worker. They don't care about the cost to our society of unemployed workers. They're just focusing on what their bottom line. And so, in fact, the investment that is occurring may actually be setting the seeds for a jobless recovery. So what is the answer? Well, actually, the answer is pretty clear. What we need to have is much more green investment. We need to have a investment based on trying to create a sustainable economy. And if we do that, we can conjoin our long-run goals of trying to create a sustainable environment and our short-term goals of a sustainable recovery. The investments that we need to retrofit the economy for global warming should be obvious. And it's not just in electricity generation. That's obvious that we need to move away from oil and fossil fuels into renewable energy, and that will be expensive, but that will be the investment that will stimulate the economy. But we have to rethink every aspect of our energy usage. Housing, the design of cities, public transportation, all of these things are going to take investments that could provide the basis of a long-term economic growth. So this kind of investment is sustainable in more than one sense. The question is raised, can we afford this? And I would try to argue that, in fact, we can't afford not to do it. And we can't afford not to do it in two senses. In the obvious one, of the long-term environmental sustainability, but also in terms of even our economy. These kinds of investments, like the investments that Marcy mentioned in technology and education, yield high returns. And the United States is lucky now in being able to borrow at very low interest rates. Close to zero short-term, 2 to 3% long-term. And the returns on these investments are sufficiently high. Economy will expand in the short run, the economy will expand in the long term, and as the economy expands, tax revenues will go up. And as the tax revenues go up, our debt will go down. We'll have more than enough revenue to pay back the debts that we've accumulated. And our sometimes called debt sustainability, the ratio of debt to GDP, will actually go down. So the kinds of policies that some people in Washington are talking about, of austerity, which is going in the other way, cutting back on our investments, cutting back on investments in education and technology and infrastructure and the environment, are going in exactly the wrong direction. They're actually making our recovery and our long-term growth less sustainable. Well, let me now turn to the final section of my talk about a few remarks about Hawaii, which is obviously, you know, endowed with sunshine, a strategic location, a diverse population, and a high level of innovativeness. Normally at Columbia, when there would have been this kind of excess demand, they would have pushed them all out and say, too bad. And I think this is, even if it's a little bit uncomfortable, an innovative solution to the problem. So with all these rich endowments, the question is, how could one make growth stronger and more sustainable? Well, obviously, as an economist, we tend to focus on what is some of the impediments. Some of the impediments are natural. Location is an advantage and a disadvantage, a distance from mainland, but halfway between, United States and the fastest growing region in the world, Asia, which is growing just remarkably fast. But as an economist, we also tend to focus on some of the man-made impediments, and that's what I want to talk about. You can't change your geography. It makes me think of a joke, a story about a lot of discussion about why Africa is not doing well. And there's been a lot of research, a lot of papers written on the subject. And the first set of papers talked about the projects that they were designing weren't working well. And then the second set talked about the policies that weren't well designed, and the third set talked about the institutions that weren't right. And then there's a whole group of studies that came out of the World Bank and elsewhere talking about the problems of geography. And an African friend of mine said, look at, I understand when you first said we had to change do a better job on our projects, and then a better job on our policy, and then a better job on our institutions. But how are we supposed to change our geography? And another one replied, well, you just get more beachfront property. And obviously that's your solution to your geography problem. Well, and it was actually, so let me talk about what I see just very casually as some of the man-made barriers that ought to be dealt with. Well, Hawaii has a history of being dominated by some large economic interests, and the economy has not been as competitive as it should be. Now, small economies often have problems with getting vibrant competition. Size makes, when you have a larger economy, you can have more firms. But in fact, at least in some areas, there's less competition than there could be. There's some man-made barriers to competition, man-made or either man-made or created by industries. I jokingly say at the business school, one of the things we teach that it's no fun being in a competitive industry. The nature of competition is that it drives profits down to zero or to a normal rate of return, and you're not going to be wealthy if you're going to get just a normal rate of return. And so what we try to teach in the business school is how to create barriers to entry, to make markets less competitive, and to do all those things that, as economists, we say are really bad, but it's the only source of making money. Anyway, that was sort of a joke, but I'm afraid there's a little bit of grain of truth in it. These monopolies and other kinds of what we call rent-seeking activities do two things to an economy. They first create a lot of inequality. And secondly, the cost of these get borne by consumers. They get passed on inevitably. and they impede economic growth and development. And so, if you take this as a perspective, fighting against ranks, fighting against monopolies, making markets more competitive is a way of both simultaneously getting more equality in society and a stronger economy and higher growth. So the view that we can only get more equality by giving up on growth, I think is basically wrong. We can get more equality and stronger growth. And it's not just, some of the monopolies are government created. I'll give you some examples, but some of the monopolies and distortions, and some of them arise out of firms creating market barriers, and it's the failure of government not to enforce competition law. And that's why we have antitrust. That's why we have a competition, the Federal Trade Commission, to stop these monopolies, but it's a battle. And the monopolists often win. And if you look around in our economy, you can see large pockets of monopoly. And actually, many of these pockets of monopoly are in key sectors of the economy and are closely linked with some of the major sources of inequality in our society. Well, there are three that obviously seem to glare to an outsider as he looks around. Maybe I'm wrong, but one of them is the lack of competition on inter-island transport. When you have a number of a set of islands that are a state and they need to communicate with each other, if you have high barriers between them, you create a smaller economy and a less efficient economy. So this is obviously something that's key and ought to be dealt with. The second one is high electricity prices. You know, looking at your electricity prices, it's really very impressive. Let me say a little bit about these impressive electricity prices. Two things should have happened in the last 20 years that should have brought these electricity prices down relative to the rest of the country. The first is one of the reasons that electricity prices might have been high is the scale. Used to be large economies of scale, big electricity scale had lower cost, but the major change in technology is that that's changed a great deal over the last 20 years. In particular, and this is related to the second point, which is the growth of renewable energy. You have a really big energy source here called the sun. And you can, new technology enable you to convert that sun power into electricity. And the cost of doing that has really plummeted. And you're also fortunate the federal government is willing to subsidize this. So that between the two of these factors, the cost of electricity relative to what's going on in the rest of the country, which depends on oil and gas, and oil prices have been shooting up, should have made the energy price differential here come down. Well, the question is, why not? I'll leave that to you as a challenge to solve. But let me give you a couple of hints. It's very important, as I said, to create a competitive and efficient electricity system based on renewables. And I think if you did that, it would do much to increase standards of living here and make Hawaii more competitive. Well, One of the problems, and it's not only in Hawaii, but in other states as well, but the consequences in Hawaii are much worse than in other states, is access to the grid. The grid is a common carrier, and if you had access to the grid, anybody could put solar panels on their rooftops and begin to sell into the grid. You could have multiple producers of energy, of electricity, and the cost of doing it would be a fraction of the cost that you're paying today. So in many states across the country, the established electricity industry doesn't like this idea because it would mean that their prices would go down. They would become less competitive, and their profits would disappear. They might even make losses because they're basing on fossil fuel. But those are outmoded technologies which are very bad for our environment. And they're not paying the full cost because the price of oil in the United States does not reflect the carbon emissions, the cost of the carbon emissions that they have. So it's a distorted market. So in a sense, all of us are subsidizing oil, and they're using their monopoly over the grid to stifle alternative energy providers. So it seems to me that this ought to be the highest priority in reform of Now, what is interesting is that other countries have actually solved this problem. So other countries have managed to get a large fraction of their production of renewables done by small producers. You don't have to have these big producers. You could do it on a small scale. And that really democratizes the production of energy, and it changes the dynamics of our society. Well, the third distortion that affects Hawaii a great deal is the Jones Act. And this was an issue that I worked on when I was in the Council of Economic Advisors. It was a major impediment. For those of you who don't know, this is the law that requires American ships to carry cargo between American ports, and that means that the only people that can transship from Hawaii to the mainland are American ships, which tend to be more expensive. And it means that you can't use transshipment. You can't go from Asia, drop off something in Hawaii, pick up something in Hawaii, and transmit it to the United States. And so it really increases the cost of shipping. And since your advantage is your location, but it's also your disadvantage, it imposes a disproportionate burden on Hawaii. Now, interestingly, I had not really focused on that issue when I was in the Clinton administration. I just focused on the fact that it was an outrageous restriction on trade in a country that says it believes in free markets. And that we did a calculation. I can't remember the exact numbers, and of course those numbers are almost 20 years ago. But the cost even then per job was like $250,000 per job. So that in terms of the efficiency, if we want to create jobs, worried about jobs, this is not the way to do it. There are better ways of doing it, like supporting environmentally sustainable development. So, and the number of jobs affected were really minuscule. So the fact that this increases the cost, and that in fact that there seems to be less competition in maritime trade between Hawaii and the mainland than there ought to be, all of that makes the cost, the economic distance, in some sense, of Hawaii from the mainland greater, increases cost. So these are all elements of economic policy, man-made barriers that could easily be changed, almost changed overnight, if there were the political will. And so these are the kinds of things that I think, you say you can't change geography, but you can change some of these man-made barriers. Well, let me just conclude with a couple, one more brief remark about sustainability. The basic aspect of sustainability is that in some sense we treat the future, we treat the environment with respect. One aspect of that that's very important is that today most of us live in cities, and making cities livable is therefore absolutely essential to our standard of living. And it's not an easy task. Now, cities in America are much better than the cities were in England 150 years ago. If you read any of the Dickens novels, they were dirty, smelly, dangerous, unpleasant places. And they're better than they were 40 years ago in the United States before we passed environmental regulations. I grew up in Gary, Indiana. I'm sure my life expectancy is shorter as a result of that. But it was, now I go through it and it's cleaner, not because the steel mills aren't working, because they still are working, but because environmental regulations force them to be cleaner. As I said, there are many dimensions to our focus on global warming. One of them is the design of our cities. It's also very important for making cities livable. So designing cities is absolutely essential to our long-term standard of living, with most of us, as I say, living in cities. An essential part of that is public transportation. That the reliance on cars is not sustainable. And if everybody in the world aspires to America's consumption patterns, including our consumption of cars, again, as I said before, our planet is doomed. So we ought to think about what would happen if everybody lived the way we do and realize that it's not feasible. The rest of the world, standard of living incomes are going up. Incomes in China have been going up, but their growth rate has been at 10% a year. Recently in India, it's been at 9% a year. And as they grow, they're going to want more cars. We are setting a very bad example. And unless we change and show them there is another way of making cities actually more livable, and with a lower carbon footprint, as I say, our planet is doomed. So that's why I think it is absolutely essential to think of designing public transportation systems that will, in the urban areas at least, largely replace automobiles. There's some hard choices of the best way to do so, but in my mind, there is no alternative. Let me just conclude with a few very brief remarks. Since 1980, we have created an economy that was not sustainable. We thought we were doing well. We looked at GDP. GDP was not a good measure of success. I chaired a commission at the request of President Sarkozy. If people say the French know about living. But that wasn't really why he did it. He was really concerned about the environment, and he believed that our national income statistics, our GDP, didn't adequately reflect what was going on. And as he put it, if we measure the wrong things, we'll do the wrong things. If our GDP measure doesn't include things that are important, it'll direct us in the wrong direction. And as a politician, he was very sensitive to it, because what he said is, look, if I don't maximize GDP, people will criticize me, but if I do, they won't be happy. Because what they care about is their environment. They care about, they want their living standards to go up, but they want, as part of their living standards, is the environment. And so we need to have a measure that includes the environmental impacts, long-run sustainability, and impacts on the representative individuals. If GDP is going up, but most individuals' income is going down, as has been happening in the United States for the last 15 years, it's not a good economy. So those of you who want to see our report, it's available in a little book called Mismeasuring Our Lives, Why GDP Doesn't Add Up. But the point I want to make is that we've, in a sense, been pursuing a false goal, a goal that doesn't really reflect what will make us as a society and as individuals well off in the future. What we have to remember is that an economy is supposed to serve our citizens, not the other way around. And I know this is a radical idea, but it is actually true. And it's important that our economy serves our citizens not just today, but for generations to come. And when we don't think about sustainability, we are, in some sense, inevitably sacrificing our future and our future generations. What I've hoped I've just been able to sketch out in this very brief amount of time is that there is an alternative. There's an alternative path which can, I think, lead to not only a robust recovery, but sustainable growth. And that that alternative has to involve a change in focus into sustainability in all three dimensions: economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and social sustainability. Thank you.